my goodness, that was just an absolute tragedy. But we'll get to George Russell's situation a little later on, but the fact of the matter is, though, there were plenty of winners to be had, and Lewis was one of them. But at the same time, all of the online discourse kind of just soured the situation for me. It just felt a little bit like, oh, really? Yes, Lewis won the race, and on the Saturday he was absolutely on it to get himself into the mix for pole, despite some tricky Friday practice sessions in the wet. And in the first half of the race, he was making confident overtakes on Checo and Charles almost immediately, making the entire field look like they should really fear Mercedes again. It was quite obvious that Lewis was one of the best drivers on the grid during the Belgian Grand Prix, and that the win was really coming toward him. But you've got to admit, trying out the one-stop strategy, despite all of the iffy information that the teams were getting on the Friday, but then of course this is where we get to the bone of the contention, that George was the one to do the one-stop, and that Lewis was stuck to two. He was aggrieved by the supposed team orders that he had to do the other alternate strategy, whereas George got to do the sole one. But need I remind folks, they were allowed to race. However, in a way, I feel like Lewis kind of got it off pretty easy, because ultimately, the whole situation regarding the disqualification of George Russell is simply down to the fact that Mercedes really doesn't know for sure why it even happened. Really, Lewis was probably happy that he didn't go on the one-stop strategy, because most likely, Lewis's car was checked at the same time as George, because, you know, if one Mercedes is underway, maybe the other one might be, but then ultimately it seems that Hamilton was cleared. And if both Mercedes had been disqualified, it would have imploded the internet. And according to Toto, there was no favoritism, but there was a need to cover Leclerc and Norris, and Lewis would have been the better one to do that with fresher tyres than George with rubber, which could have fallen off the cliff at any moment. At this point in the race, no one was really sure how long the hard tyres would last. People were thinking, well, of course you're going to do a two-stop strategy. They basically had no idea this would have ended up being a nuisance for Lewis, who was told that he could race him. But I digress. Lewis's car was with him, and he now has another win under his belt going into the break, which will do wonders for his confidence, and it's good to see him in contention for victory again. However, all the stuff that's been going around the internet regarding George and Lewis, and saying, oh, George cheated, and oh, Lewis was robbed of a win, and, you know, he was mad, and he didn't want to talk to Piastri, and he's sabotage again. I'm like, stop! This is not what Mercedes are in for. You really think that Mercedes would play fast and loose with the rules? It doesn't really matter. Even if Mercedes goes to the police about this, it's still going to happen. So I think Mercedes will be happy to see the back of all this discourse online. And now Ferrari are going to be getting it. And, I really feel for Charles. But then, of course, we got to talk about the other sensation, especially at the end of the race, which really gave Mercedes a bit of a fright and could have easily blown it if they wanted a 1-2 if Oscar just went past, and that is indeed Oscar Piastri. And yes, I will preface by saying that it was indeed one of Oscar's actions, that being him overshooting the pit stop, which cost him the race for him, because he did lose 2 and a bit seconds in the pit stops. As well as the team pitting in at all, actually, because they could have made the one-stop work based on how good the tyres were in clear air. But had it not been for that immovable Jackman, he needs praise, because it could have been even worse. But you know what? I feel like this performance of Oscar's was even more impressive than the first half of the Hungarian GP. Admittedly, I was a little bit antsy that Piastri wasn't able to get past Checo at the beginning of the race, that there was something going on, and that the pace that we were expecting from McLaren was not to be, and that Checo was going to be resuming his role as the Mexican Minister of Defense and holding on for third place. Hearing Oscar over the radio, it was just brimming with control, calmness, and even a smidge of charm. You know, saying clean air is king. And you got to admit that those last 10-ish laps or so of Oscar hunting down the Mercedes, that, oh, Lewis was not going to be let through, and George and he were going to fight, and then there's this McLaren coming up, and it's not Lando, but it's Oscar, the one who's infamously really bad with his tyres. Wow! Where was that earlier? I think the whole debate about Oscar's time management, it really needs to start to degrade now, because the last 2 races have been really, really solid, and yes, I know, you'll be saying, well, oh, he's only doing that because of clean air. Well, every single driver will crave the clean air. That's just what people want. A nice bit of space to get the most out of your tyres without being in dirty air behind another car, because the whole purpose of the 2022 cars have been rendered moot now because of engineers being good at their job. And Zach was lucky to get away with only having a mohawk wig and not actually having to shave his hair off and get a mohawk, which was the deal supposedly for Oscar if he got back-to-back wins instead of a tattoo like Lando and Ricciardo had. But it does make you think again, and we will touch upon this with Lando, that maybe McLaren were just a little bit too conservative, that yeah, okay, they didn't really botch the strategy, it was a perfectly fine strategy, but there was some wriggle room, as it turned out, to maybe try the one stop and see where it goes, because I don't remember Oscar having any issues with tyre degradation. Oscar could have won the race by maybe about like 4 or 5 seconds or something, or just bringing it back home, maybe even just 3, that would have done. But we do need to talk about Charles Leclerc as well, because this was a bit of a win for him, even though it may not look it on the surface. Now, even though Charles admits that he wasn't all that pleased with 3rd place ultimately, well, 4th place on the road, and losing his pole, quite easily actually, a podium from him off the back of 4th in Hungary is still something to be pleased with going into the summer break. Now, of course, this is not the results that we were seeing from Ferrari at the beginning of the season, when they looked like genuine championship contenders, and a win was practically a certainty for them, or at least a very strong likelihood, or a consistent 2nd place and podium. And I think even in qualifying, when he was conducting interviews, he knew he was going to fall back down the grid. Probably he was expecting to maybe fall back into 5th or 6th or something, but hanging on to a podium finish at the end of it, that's not too shabby. And considering that Charles' confidence has been knocked severely, this is another win for him to show that, hey, his car still has it. They've at least prevented the SF24 from slipping even further down the order, because the Mercedes has just gone right past them, and even Charles says so. They expected to have an edge over the Mercedes, but it turns out that they didn't. But of course, the disqualification gave Ferrari a bit of a save. But hey, let's be fair here, Ferrari also were able to keep Max Verstappen behind Charles, so he couldn't just sail right past him. And they also did have the luxury of medium and hard tyres to choose from, so they could have picked the right strategy. Sure, they didn't exactly push the boat out with Charles, but you also got to look at the speed trap. Charles Leclerc's top speed was way behind anybody else's. It was clear they were going for a high downforce setup to try and get themselves away from other cars in the twisty bits of Sector 2. But there is still a bit of a debate about whether or not they are going to be the 4th fastest car by the time we get to Zandvoort. We shall see about that, we shall see. But one thing we do need to make clear here is that maybe we were all a little bit too harsh on Esteban Ocon given recent revelations. Based on those revelations that Ocon had been dropping about Alpine like a stone in a surprisingly honest moment from him, I kind of feel sorry for the guy. Having to deal with he and other Alpine drivers being ignored, his company car being tracked to a visit to the Williams factory, and of course a general lack of direction for the last few years. I think even Ocon has to admit that maybe Fernando leaving the team and going to Aston Martin was not such a bad idea, that it was a lost cause. Maybe Oscar Piastri deciding to break ties with Alpine and go to McLaren, be a little bit cutthroat. Maybe that wasn't such a bad idea. Alpine might have peaked in 2021 when Ocon got his first and only victory thus far. Since the ground effect era, it's all been downhill, and Ocon's been fighting a losing battle trying to get heard, but then he doesn't get heard. And Alonso's been dealing with it, Gasly's probably been dealing with it, but Gasly doesn't really have any options, so he's got to make do with it. So yeah, maybe this is just a way for us to kind of feel like, hey, okay, Ocon might have been angry because he didn't really have much to work with. I mean, sure, Esteban is a hothead normally, but the circumstances of his time in the ground effect era have only sought to exacerbate that even more, so that is something to consider. But either way, here at Spa, Ocon was a solid driver, making the most of the damp conditions to get into Q3 and then secure a couple of points, which will help solidify 8th in the team standings for Alpine. Yeah, okay, sure, it's 8th place for Alpine. That is a major come down, but I think that's the best they're going to hope for this year, whilst they're regrouping, they're restructuring, rehiring people, because let's be honest here, Bruno Famin, what exactly did he do at Alpine? He fired a bunch of people and then he left. That's pretty much it. That's what was in his tenure. And not to mention, Haas did really well in the triple header and put paid to any hopes of 7th in the constructors. But I think Alpine did bring some upgrades here, which kind of worked, and they did provide some hope. So here's hoping that they might be able to keep in front of Williams or something like that. I mean, they do view them as direct competition since they supposedly banned Ocon from making a mid-season jump. And not to mention, they were really slippery down the straights. They did get some overtakes down pretty easily. Even Gasly benefited from it, even though he finished 13th. So, okay, fairly solid for Ocon, not too bad. Then there was Ricciardo. Now, Daniel seemed very happy about his situation, didn't he? Even though he secured a point after penalties, he did seem quite chill about getting 11th as the car felt decent. But the V-Carb didn't quite have enough in the tank when compared to Alpine and Alonso to push forward with that one-stop strategy. It was the other V-Carb that tried out the one-stop strategy, albeit with scrubbed hard tyres, Tsunoda starting right at the back after getting that 60-place grid penalty, which means I can't put him in the losers because he was already having to deal with all of that nonsense. I think there are some bigger things on Daniel's mind, which makes me think that, you know what, I think he'll take this point because he might be scoring a few more points in the second half of the season. Because I had a source on the ground saying that Daniel was especially cheery on the grid, when Dr. Marco and he had a really hearty handshake and a good luck situation at the beginning of the race, meaning that maybe some kind of deal was done and that maybe Daniel might be getting a chance at Red Bull this year already? Because hey, if the situation is looking likely that Red Bull are not the top at the moment, then maybe there's less risk of putting Daniel there. And considering there's a meeting taking place today regarding what Red Bull will be going into in the second half of the year, not just Checo, perhaps Daniel knows that he's done enough to get that second chance at Red Bull next to Max, and that Checo's days are numbered. And also, there's a matter of a test going on Wednesday, I think at Imola with the AT03. It's a shootout between Lawson and Ricciardo. Who will do better will probably dictate where people are going to go. Does Daniel stay at VCAR for the rest of the season and Lawson gets a chance at Red Bull? Or vice versa? We don't know. Because we will certainly not find out the lap times, or at least the full-on lap times, because that's not really happened this season. Not even with the filming day that Lawson did. Supposedly there was a rumour that he was 2 tenths slower, but that's not been officially confirmed. Then there was the shootout between Doohan and Schumacher and Antonelli, Antonelli's private tests. We did not hear anything regarding the times, and they've been keeping them close to their chests. But I do think that Daniel is sitting pretty on something. So it was a win for him, regardless of what happened on track. And now a little bit of a win here. It's not much, but I think it will do for Fernando Alonso. Aside from George, Fernando is the other top 10 driver to make the one-stop solution work well, despite not being enough to figure with Verstappen charging up the order. Aston Martin looked okay this time out, and in Alonso's hands it was enough to get a few points and consolidate 5th place in the team standings at least. And I think it also helped Alonso's morale that Lance Stroll had a bit of a mardy of a weekend, and he was really not doing well in practice where he's supposed to be good in damp conditions, and he didn't really figure out in terms of getting in for the points even though he was close also on the one stop. Ultimately, Alonso was the faster driver, and after a few races where he was the slower of the Aston Martin drivers, I think he will consider this a win, and I think not getting any sassy radio quotes from Fernando, that's a win in and of itself as well. Then we get to the meh situation, and Lando Norris heads this list. And okay, I'll go easy on Lando somewhat, since he did have to deal with the loss of his Belgian grandma over the course of the last few days, and he wanted to make her proud by getting his best result at Spa ever. Well, okay, in fairness, he did do that. P5 is his best result at Spa in his F1 career, but I'm pretty sure that he wouldn't want to have settled for 5th place, and probably would have wanted to get something a little bit higher. Going wide into turn 1 and losing many places really didn't help his cause, but Norris simply couldn't get through the traffic, and was stuck behind many drivers, including Max, with not enough confidence or clear air to make up places. And like I said with Piastri, it really didn't help matters that McLaren were really conservative when it came to the pit stops. In Norris's case, I think they were going to be considering the 2-stop regardless, but they did not perform the undercut again. And this wasn't by like 1 or 2 laps or so. I think Norris's first stop came in at lap 15, whereas the majority of the people ahead of him stopped on like laps 10 through 12. So that was a major loss of time. And I don't know why they're doing this. They cannot be like this because the undercut is proving to be extremely powerful with these cars, at least this year, but McLaren haven't gotten that memo yet. Yes, Norris had a lot of adversity against him, and let's just be fair here, he was doing well enough to prevent Max Verstappen from scampering away and being left alone for 5th place ultimately, but at the same time, he had the faster car. It was the better car than the RB20, the MCL38, and Norris just didn't have enough in the tank to get past Max. He could not do it, whereas Oscar was making up places, especially coming out of the pits behind Russell and immediately getting past him. That's what the McLaren cars need to do. But it is a complicated situation for him. We might see him come back and fly come the Dutch Grand Prix after a bit of a break and away from social media, or we could see him spiral. But I really want it to be the former. I want both McLaren drivers to be right at the top of their game, especially Lando, since he does deserve this after all of these years with a car that has sometimes been good, but other times it hasn't been. He deserves a chance at the top, he really does. But let's just hope McLaren learn to be a little bit bolder with their pit stop calls, right? Now, speaking of the Dutch Grand Prix, home soil might help Max regroup as well, after most likely a few weeks away from social media and probably ploughing his time into sim racing, or maybe some quality time with his family, whichever he likes. But I think it's quite clear that he is coming to terms now that the RB20 is not the best car in Formula 1 anymore. And I think I heard an interview where he said that he doesn't think that he could win a race again this season. Now, okay, I think that is hyperbole. I think that is an over-exaggeration. Max Verstappen not winning another race this year. I think that's a little much, Max. So I think that might be a bit of sandbagging or a diversionary tactic, or just feeling a little low. And he did do well going up from 11th to 4th place in a car that is probably not the best anymore. So that is a fair shout, and I did predict he'd get 4th, and he got it. So I don't think this was a bad race for him. In fact, he was quite positive. In fact, his language entirely was a lot more supportive and, of course, less colourful. And, of course, he was compromised with the fact that Red Bull did not have a second set of hard tyres to work with, but he was able to hold off Norris in a better car to prove a point that he was not going to give up. And also, this is a really big point because if Max is not able to just romp away at the front by about 10-15 seconds, the constructors is really getting tight. Red Bull are now 42 points ahead of McLaren. That means that if McLaren bag a 1-2 and a double DNF is had at Zandvoort for both Red Bull drivers, regardless whether it's Checo in the second seat or not, that means McLaren will take the lead in the constructors, so it is getting tight. But I am pleased to see Max a little bit more measured than he has been in recent times, so that's good. I'm glad that there's been some sort of harmony established at Red Bull, at least on Max's side. Then we get to Sainz, and I've got to hand it to Carlos. He managed to make that hard tyre work wonders at the beginning, and I believe he was even bold enough to consider a one-stop strategy. The tyre deg on Sunday was a lot lower than expected from all concerned. However, I think I chuckled a little bit, because when I heard Carlos on the radio say, I think we decide to go long or maybe try a one-stop strategy, I think 2 laps later, they pitted him in anyway. However, what we did get was a short second stint, and then the third stint just took him out of contention. If there had been a safety car, then it might have allowed him to jump past Max and Norris, but it just wasn't enough in the end. It was a quiet race weekend. It was okay. I appreciate Carlos for being bold at the beginning, so it did provide some intrigue and interest in those first 10 laps, whilst I was pulling my hair out at Piastri not getting past Checo. So, okay, it's fine. It's a little bit tenuous, this meh outcome, but yeah, okay, whatever. Ferrari did okay. Then we get to the losers, and George has to be here, but it's tragic. Absolutely tragic. He made the one-stop work, and in his mind, he had done the job. He also held off his teammate on fresher tyres. Had the disqualification not happened, it would have been a hugely incredible fight back from P6 on the grid. Now, I know that you're going to say that Max did better than that, going from 14th to 1st, but this isn't Max Verstappen. This is George Russell establishing himself and trying out the strategy, which was bold. It was different. Not many drivers tried it. They weren't in the position to try it. Toto was looking at the simulations and thinking, well, the best that George can do is P5, so hey, why not? Let's listen to the kid. And what we got was wonderful. But then what we got later on was absolutely heartbreaking. I'm glad that George is willing to bounce back from this, that this isn't going to destroy him almost as much as it did in Sakir. But this is strike 2 for Mercedes fumbling something which robs George of potential victory. Yes, Sakir was slightly different because there was no disqualification there, but George was in front. Then Mercedes got a radio glitch which brought him in, put him on Bottas's tyres, which is against the rules, so he had to come back and change them to his tyres. And then he had a puncture. He fell from 1st or 2nd behind Checo to 9th, because if he had won that race, I think Bottas would have been toast for 2021. The team here let him down again, and they seemingly got no clear explanation for his car being 1.5 kilos underweight. But the ultimate reason from the steward had something to do with above average plank wear, not enough to go over the limit, but it was notable, and the weight of the hard tyres being lower than expected. I think there is a reasonable explanation for this which would explain it, because at Spa, they do things slightly differently at the end of the race. Now, at the end of a typical race, you're familiar with the cars going slower. They go off the racing line, they go on the dirty bits where there are marbles, basically discarded rubber shredded off of the tyres. They then go over those to pick them up because they've got hot sticky tyres, they'll attach themselves to them, they'll gain weight, and therefore when they come to the weigh-in station for the car, they will be over the minimum weight limit, and therefore all is hunky-dory. Now this isn't the case of George cheating, no, this is available to all the drivers, this is just what they do. But unfortunately we didn't get that because after La Source, all of the cars are immediately told to pit straight away, going up the pit lane in the wrong direction, well, a different direction this time around, and then going from there, so you don't get that opportunity. So Mercedes really have to go back and think what happened that cost George his 3rd win in F1. To those of you thinking that George was cheating, he was absolutely not. Toto admitted it, that they let him down. They didn't do the calculations. There are many theories about why that could have been the case, including the fact that going back to that upgrade that they brought for Belgium, which they ultimately didn't use, maybe they took calculations back then and they didn't factor in the old floor or the old parts, and therefore their parameters were all over the place and they weren't correct for the race, where they would have been in practice, FP1, because it was drier. So they could have just had some simple oversight which compromised Russell's setup, and then him going out for the long, they weren't thinking about that, and if they were really on the ball, they could have realised that by the end of the race, they might not have had enough carcass on the tyres, so it would have been unsafe or risky. They could have ended up disqualification. There are lots of things going on which could have really made George's life a little easier. This was not a case of George cheating, it was a case of Mercedes realising they messed up, and they realised that George was going to be absolutely crestfallen. I think even Toto realised that, yes, we might have screwed the pooch with that one. I really hope George can switch off from this. But I think Checo is also really in danger of having his career switched off entirely. Now, yes, I know you're going to say, but he got the fastest lap. Yeah, he did. But that wasn't a case of performance. That was just the old tactic of, let's just stop him for softs because he's ahead of Alonso anyway and just steal a point from the competitors. That's what Checo is being used for. Let's be honest, this was probably his last race for Red Bull, or in F1 altogether if another team doesn't pick him up for next year. Going from 2nd to 7th? That's not a good look when many of his front-runner fellows were either holding steady where they were or pushing forward. Even Marco was a bit perplexed and going, this was not good. He completely collapsed. I mean, I think Marco was expecting a tour de force, or at least having Checo qualify on the front row, that he would have remained at least in the top 5, or at least better yet on the podium, but he didn't even do that. According to Checo, something on the medium tyres was just not playing well with the setup and the strategy, and therefore he fell through. And that is admittedly true. Verstappen was dealing with that same issue. This was just the strategy call they did. They thought the medium tyres would work. It just wasn't quite enough because the hard tyre was better over the course of a race distance. This was a situation where Checo needed to perform and remain in the top 3, having qualified so well. So in a way, had he qualified 7th and remained 7th, that might not have been so bad as starting 2nd and then falling down the order. Or even then, he could have done his damnedest to support Max and maybe hold off Norris, bring him out of contention, but I think there was a point in the race where Checo was holding up Max longer than he should have done. But now at this point, he's 150 points nearly behind Max, and even though George's disqualification has saved him from being 8th in the driver's standings, 7th is not that much better, considering now he is a fair distance behind the likes of Hamilton for 6th. I can't see him sticking around for much longer unless he and his team pull off the biggest pitch of their career, even more than that first contract extension. Then we get to Haas. It was a very muted race for Haas, with Hülkenberg trying a really early change to hards, but it was a little bit too early, as most of the front runners came in on lap 10 or 11. Lap 7, that was a little too early. They didn't really get much advantage on the medium tyres, so that ultimately meant that Hülkenberg didn't really have any pace or harmony. It was all disjointed, even he thought so. So there wasn't really much he could do. It was a worthwhile go because Haas didn't look like they had the pace at all. Kevin Magnussen did slightly better. He managed to get 14th or something. The one-stop did work for him quite well, considering where he started, so it was okay. But I think even Komatsu knows that they've got some work to do. And the triple header, yeah, it was a good run. It's managed to solidify 7th place for them, so that's not too bad. They've done much better than last year. They should really be proud of themselves. This race wasn't it. Plain and simple. But one thing you should give them credit for, again with Magnussen, that they made that one-stop work, because the Haas of last year and the many years before that would not have made that work. So there is progress going on. It's just going to take a while. Then there was Sauber. At one point, I almost saw Bottas clinch a point. He was 10th for quite a while, before he then came in for a second stop. But hey, at least the team weren't crushingly last, and yes, of course, Zhou did suffer a mechanical failure which caused him to retire, so it wasn't best, and this still leaves Sauber with 0 points on the docket. But all of this is going on is sort of, playing second fiddle to the fact that Seidel is gone. James Key will probably go from his role as the designer of the car because it's turning out to be terrible. Mattia Binotto's coming in. There's a little bit of a state of flux going on at Sauber, so this wasn't the worst race possible. It could have been better, but at least Bottas had some hope, and he might have some hope of securing a place with Sauber for next year because Seidel was clearly going to be getting rid of Valtteri. Binotto might look more favourably toward Valtteri in a sake for continuity, almost, alongside Hülkenberg. But then again, there might be Checo on the market, and if Checo does become available for Sauber or Audi, I think they will pick him up. And I really want them to, because that will mean another team prediction that I brought would have come true. And getting Checo back alongside Hülkenberg, former Sauber drivers, Checo even started his career in F1 with Sauber, and he did really well there. That's what established himself to be so good that McLaren hired him. And then there was Stroll. Lance, you thought your car was slow? No. According to the speed trap, your car was the fastest, and nearly 10 miles an hour faster than your teammate's car. In any case, this was a major come down for a driver who'd been doing fairly well and was competitive against Alonso, a 2-time world champion. Now, even though it's got me itching toward the foam of doubt as to why that's the case, I don't have to hold that anymore, because I think the Belgian Grand Prix pretty much snuffed out any hope of him retaining the reputation of him being good in changeable conditions, because he was the only one to crash significantly during the whole weekend, and he ripped off that car. He qualified 15th, a second behind Bottas. I don't know whether that was because he had a lap time deleted for track limits, or he just couldn't get enough time to get that next lap in. It's still not a good look if a Sauber is qualifying ahead of you, considerably. But to be fair, he almost got a point because the one-stop plan worked for him as well as Alonso, but it wasn't enough to get past Ricciardo, so he can live to fight another day in keeping his place in the top 10 of the driver's standings, Lance. But just stepping back to the Sauber situation for a second. Now, you might be thinking, Mattia Binotto back there. Oh, great, the clown show's just moved to a different team. Well, not so. Him coming in as a major player in the new Audi project isn't as silly as you might think at first. For starters, he is in the right role. Something that I discuss more in detail here in this video that you can go and watch next. It's actually quite a smart decision, and I think Audi might make waves.